My name is Sarah, and I've always considered myself a part of this family, even though, in reality, I was just the nanny. My name was never mentioned in family circles, my opinions and voice were often ignored, but when my grandmother, Marjorie, passed away, I found myself at the center of a plot that I could never have predicted. Fate decided that I would be the one at the reading of her will, even though I was merely her assistant. My grandmother, though a bit strict, always treated me like family, and I regarded her as a second mother. She taught me many life lessons: how to be strong, how to fight for my independence, and how not to be afraid to speak the truth. I was nervous and unsure, standing before the huge wooden table in the room where all her family had gathered. The room smelled of old wood and expensive perfume. There was her son, my Uncle Thomas, who had always seemed cold and ruthless to me, and my Aunt Joanna, who always looked down on me. And then there were her two daughters-in-law, who never hid their disdain for me, calling me the nanny, as if I had no right to be here. The lawyer, Sir James, was a middle-aged man with a face that always exuded calm, no matter the situation. He opened the will with a serious demeanor, offering a faint smile, and began to read. I, Marjorie Ellenson, of sound mind and memory. He began, but my thoughts wandered. I couldn't forget the look Mary and Joanna had given me the day before. It seemed like they thought I didn't belong here at all. All of my property, including my home and land, I bequeathed to my son, Thomas Ellenson, and my daughter, Joanna. He continued, and I felt my chest tighten with fear. I, as always, was nobody. But what was this? Where was I? I remained in complete ignorance. And finally, I leave my collection of rare books and antique jewelry to Sarah. The lawyer unexpectedly said, and I felt the world freeze. All eyes turned to me, and in my Aunt Joanna's gaze, I saw surprise and even something akin to anger. Thomas shook his head. Do you really think she deserves all of this? He whispered almost inaudibly, but I heard him. She's just the nanny. Joanna exclaimed. I felt her gaze pierce me, as though I were something insignificant. But something in the lawyer's voice changed. He smiled and looked at us with an unusual calmness. Please, let me finish, he said, his smile widening slightly. My thoughts raced. I didn't understand what was happening, why this was happening to me, a person they considered nothing more than part of the background of their household. I was just the nanny, as Joanna liked to remind me. But now, here I was, in the center of it all, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sir James continued. And now, my dear ones, regarding what Sarah will receive. He paused. I felt all eyes fall on me. Sarah will receive not only the rare books and jewelry, but also 50% of everything remaining of my client's estate, Marjorie Ellenson. The room fell into silence. I could hear my heart pounding. I couldn't believe my ears. What was this? That moment when everything I had ever believed to be true turned out to be a lie. My grandmother left me half of her inheritance. Thomas turned pale, Joanna composed herself, but her face showed clear displeasure. Mary, who had said nothing until then, now stared at me with her mouth open, and I stood there, not knowing what to do. How was I supposed to react to this? Sir James smiled at our silent reaction. You thought she was just a nanny. But as it turns out, Sarah was not just an important part of your mother's life, she was also her trusted confidant. And perhaps the closest person to her in the last few years, he said with respect, his gaze full of significance. I felt a lump in my throat. My grandmother. I didn't know she valued me so much. And now, what would happen next? After the lawyer announced that I would receive half of my grandmother's estate, a tense silence settled in the room. Just a moment ago, everyone was sure that everything would go to either Thomas or Joanna. For all these years, I had been nothing but the nanny to them, and I had seen how this disdain reflected on my position. But now they stood stunned, their faces not only filled with anger but also with something more dangerous, fear. My gaze met Thomas's. His face had gone pale, and his lips were pressed into a thin line. He had always been reserved, but now, it seemed like he was barely holding back his fury. Joanna, on the other hand, tried to hide her indignation behind excessive politeness. This is a mistake, she said, her voice trembling with tension. Sarah, you're just the nanny, don't you understand? I felt my heart race. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to argue. I didn't crave revenge or to attack them. But I couldn't and didn't want to hide my pain anymore. I understand, Joanna. But look at what's happening. How many years was I by your mother's side? How many times did I support her when none of you paid attention to her? My voice was firm but not aggressive. Thomas stood up from his chair, interrupting me. You don't need to explain yourself, Sarah. We all know you were just earning money doing your job. You were never part of the family, he said sharply, and his words hit me like a knife. I felt my hands begin to tremble, but I held myself together. Lawyer James intervened again, interrupting this heavy moment. Please, let me explain. His voice was low but confident. Sarah didn't just work as a nanny. Marjorie greatly valued her help. For the past several years, she was not only her personal assistant, but also the one who cared for her health and well-being. She was there when the rest of the family essentially turned their backs. When we speak of inheritance, we are also talking about attachments, trust, and duty. Marjorie decided that her grandchildren and children would get their share, but Sarah deserves much more. The lawyer's words seemed full of meaning, and I felt the tension in the room begin to ease. But Thomas and Joanna weren't ready to give up so easily. So, does that mean none of us mattered to her? Joanna asked, her voice like the hiss of a snake. Are you implying that this whole family meant nothing? I felt myself preparing for the next blow. But now, after what the lawyer had said, I couldn't stop myself. No, I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying that my grandmother, Marjorie, saw me not as a servant, but as someone who was there for her in the most difficult times. There's a big difference. And at that moment, I realized that all this time, I had been kept in the shadows, but now it was time to step into the light. Sir James turned back to the documents on the table and continued reading. But there's one more point that needs to be discussed. His eyes met mine, and I felt something subtly change in his gaze. In the will, there's a provision that none of you here, I suspect, expected to hear. Marjorie stated that she leaves Sarah the right to manage her entire collection of jewels and books, with one condition. Thomas and Joanna exchanged glances, as if expecting something important. I couldn't hide my curiosity either. A condition? I repeated, my voice sounding more anxious than I intended. Yes. The condition is that Sarah must take responsibility for all unfinished business related to the family business. This, as you understand, is quite a large task, said James, his tone completely serious. My gaze at the lawyer grew more tense. I wasn't ready for this kind of responsibility, especially when it came to the family business. But in that moment, I felt emotions flood over me. Whatever happened, I had to prove to myself and everyone else that I deserved my place in this story. I wasn't just a nanny. What do you mean? I asked, trying not to reveal my nervousness. The lawyer opened another page of the will and continued. Sarah will have to take on the management of all finances and assets related to the family business, including land, securities, and more. Marjorie believed that Sarah was the one who could preserve this business and even take it further. The silence in the room became almost unbearable. I felt dizzy. This was more than I had ever imagined. I would need to prepare for an immense amount of work, for responsibilities I had never faced before. And I knew that this was just the beginning. A few weeks had passed since the reading of the will, and I continued to reflect on every detail, every unexpected change that had taken place in my life. When I returned to my grandmother's house, already feeling the weight of her inheritance, I was stunned by the scale of the tasks ahead of me. The jewels, books, and the family business required not only financial management, but also a careful approach to the details that had been in the shadows for so long. And I had to accept and develop all of this, or it would have just become a burden. Thomas and Joanna clearly didn't expect me to succeed. Their cold stares remained, but they gradually faded into the background, making way for those who were willing to work with the business. At first, I focused on accounting and legal matters. With the help of attorney James, I was able to sort through my grandmother's estate, her land, antique collections, and the debts that remained. These tasks required attention and patience, but at some point, I realized I didn't need to continue working in the shadow of others. I didn't need to justify my role in the family. Thomas still tried to assert his control, offering help in managing things, but I was no longer the naive young woman who would obediently agree to everything. My confidence grew day by day. When I took over my grandmother's business, I first restored the company's reputation. Soon, I established important business connections, improved the financial situation, and attracted investors. I can't say it was easy. But I always remembered my grandmother's words. She believed in me, and I could no longer allow myself to doubt my abilities. Thomas couldn't hide his frustration when he realized I wasn't backing down. He often told me that I didn't belong here, and continued trying to interfere, but I made it clear that this role was now mine. At one point, he even tried to challenge the will, but attorney James was unwavering. Thomas, do you really believe you can just take this from her? You don't even understand how much she's done, not just to inherit, but to revive what Marjorie left. James said once, in such a tone that Thomas clenched his teeth, and left without saying a word. I was proud of myself. First and foremost, for not giving in to manipulation, for not allowing myself to return to the old role of the nanny, who just listened and obeyed. A couple of months later, when my grandmother's business had become significantly more profitable, and I had established good relationships with partners and developed my own strategies, I decided to meet with Thomas and Joanna. I was ready to talk to them because, despite everything that had happened, I understood that without their help, it would be hard for me to move forward. I understand that many of you expected this to be a temporary hobby for me, I began, feeling my voice grow firmer. But that's not the case. I am not just a nanny. I am Marjorie Ellenson. And now I'm running this business because I am ready to take responsibility for its future. Thomas looked at me with anger, but I saw a shadow of doubt in his eyes. Joanna looked tense, but her gaze was more respectful. I knew I had to keep moving forward, regardless of what they might do. We will work together, but only if you're willing to respect the decisions I make. I'm not asking for anything from you except that you support me, and stop seeing me as the nanny, who somehow ended up in the middle of things. My voice was firm but fair. Silence lasted for a few seconds. I could see Thomas clenching his fists, but now there was fear in his eyes. He could no longer manipulate me. I was no longer the little girl who obediently agreed to his decisions. Joanna finally spoke, and her words were quiet but respectful. You've won, Sarah. We were wrong. We thought you were just playing a role, but now we see you're capable of so much more." Those words were hard for her to say, and I knew she hadn't spoken them lightly. But she acknowledged my strength, and that was more important to me than anything. With each passing day, I became more convinced that my grandmother hadn't just left me an inheritance, but a chance to prove to myself and to others that I wasn't just a nanny. I was something more. I was a strong woman, ready for any challenge in order to succeed. Now, I could look those who once tried to humiliate me in the eye with pride. And though there had been much pain in my life, I could now say it had all been worth it. I deserved my place here. And most importantly, I had finally learned to believe in myself. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a like.